Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that is hosted by the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors, AIS for short. We are recording this session, so please keep that in mind as you ask questions or throughout the webinar. I'm Olivia Garcia. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Esperanza United, and I'd like to pass it to my colleague, Gabby, to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby Debelen, and I'm the Policy Coordinator at API-GBV, or the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And I will pass it to my colleague, Casey, to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Gabby. I'm Casey Swegman. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Tahereh Justice Center, and I will pass it to Kirsten.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. I'm Kirsten Rambo. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Executive Director at ASISTA. And glad to be with you all here today.
Thank you so much. If we could go to the next slide. So we'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We want to just share with you some logistics. We plan on having enough time for questions, so please put questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. We encourage you not to include any identifying information, and we can only answer general questions during this webinar. Also, we hope that you ask quite a bit of questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. We have folks monitoring the chat. Can you go to the next slide? We would like to tell you a little bit more about the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. As the four speakers mentioned, 4 organizations co-lead the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. The AIS, we coordinate the Immigration Subcommittee of the National Task Force to End Sexual Domestic Violence, a coalition of advocates. Our mission is to bring together advocates from all over the country who work with and for immigrant survivors who've experienced gender-based violence. Through our network, we are dedicated to advocating for and promoting policies that center immigrant survivors, their needs and experiences. And we strive to share their stories with policymakers. Next slide.
Can we also mention that we've got a couple other key players from AIS helping us out in the background today. Grace Huang and Charlie McAteer, who many of you may be familiar with from their fabulous work with AIS, are both helping us out with questions and resources and lots of other things as we do this webinar. So we're very happy to have you here. And if you want to hop on and wave, great, or say hello, that would be great. We're very grateful that you're here with us today.
Absolutely, Kirsten, thanks so much. And there's Grace. And I think, and maybe Charlie, but we're so thankful for this collaborative team, and it's definitely a team effort. So AIS's work focuses around building a network of advocates. There's Charlie. Hey, Charlie. We seek to build a network of advocates, service providers, organizations, and allies to take action on policies that impact immigrant survivors of violence. We also seek to provide tools and resources to stakeholders about the effects of immigration policies on survivors' ability to access protections and services. We spend quite a bit of time analyzing the impact of immigration-related policies on survivors of violence, and we try to use communication strategies to positively influence the public narrative around survivors. At the end of the day, we want to keep advocates educated and informed about legislative and administrative efforts. Next slide. Our values are simple. We believe in the safety and well-being for all, public safety. We use a human rights framework to do our work. We value respect, dignity, and resilience. And we have a few goals for this webinar. The first is to share background information on the WISE Act with you. We also seek to highlight how this bill will directly impact immigrant survivors. And then we want to share with you some ways that you can share information about the WISE Act. Generally, just quickly to touch on the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, which was originally passed in 1994. And this piece of legislation had a variety of immigrant provisions attached to it in 1994. There were enhancements in 2003, but we haven't seen any new or expanded provisions as related to immigrant survivors since then. And so this group works very diligently to make sure that nothing is rolled back for immigrant survivors and that we continue to advocate on their behalf in VAWA and other legislation. Casey?
Everyone, so we are going to be showing a brief video just going over the WISE Act, including a message from Representative Pramila Jayapal, who is one of the lead sponsors on this most recent version of the Working for Immigrant Safety and Empowerment Act. So I'm going to play this now, and it includes messages from each of the AIS co-chairs. I'm being told that there's no sound. Let me try it one more time. All right, let me know if folks can hear it now.
I'm Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and I'm honored to serve Washington's 7th Congressional District in the House of Representatives, where I also serve as chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And I'm so proud to have introduced the WISE Act with Congresswoman Schakowsky and Congressman Espaillat and Panetta. This legislation will protect immigrant survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and gender-based violence. Survivors of gender-based violence, child abuse, human trafficking, and other crime must be able to come forward without facing the fear of detention or deportation. This isn't just about immigration reform. It's about the safety and the well-being of communities across our country and ensuring that all survivors are able to access the protections intended by the Violence Against Women Act. Immigrant women are particularly vulnerable to domestic violence. And with this bill, we are reiterating our commitment to protect immigrant survivors, to empower them to seek help, and to ensure that their safety is not tied up with their ability to stay in this country. This legislative action would not be possible without each of you on the ground organizing in our communities. So thank you for all the work that you're doing, and know that I am right alongside you every step of the way.
Hi, I'm Grace Wong, and I'm the Director of Policy at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And I'm one of the co-chairs of the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. The Alliance for Immigrant Survivors is a network of advocates and allies dedicated to defending and advocating for policies that ensure immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and other gender-based abuses have access to life-saving protections. Right now, we're supporting the Working for Immigrant Safety and Empowerment Act, otherwise known as WISE, introduced by Representative Pramila Jayapal.
Hi, I'm Kristen Randall, Executive Director of APISA, also one of the co-chairs of the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. WISE would extend critical immigration benefits to immigrant survivors. This bill is a huge step forward towards justice for immigrant survivors with various types of immigration relief, including those who are VAWA self-petitioners, C and U visa applicants, and special immigrant juveniles. WISE lifts the U visa cap and makes the U visa program more accessible, prevents deportation or detention of immigrant survivors with pending immigration cases, requires issuance of work authorization within 180 days of application, and allows immigrant survivors with pending cases to be eligible for critical federal public benefits and no longer subject to the 5-year bar. We're excited to tell you more about why this bill is critically important for immigrant survivors and what you can do to help.
Hi, I'm Archie Piatti, CEO of the Tahoe Justice Center, another co-chair of the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. WISE lifts the U visa cap to meet the needs and makes the program more accessible to immigrant survivors. There are nearly 270,000 individuals with pending U visa cases, and these egregious delays subject survivors and their families to additional risks of violence, exploitation, manipulation, and trauma. WISE helps alleviate these risks and ensures that this program can meet the needs of survivors and offer a true path to safety. The bill also prevents deportation or detention of self-petitioners, T and U visa applicants, and special immigrant juveniles. Threats of deportation are one of the most potent tools abusers and perpetrators of crime use to maintain control over and silence immigrant survivors. Abusers and perpetrators leverage the immigration system against immigrant survivors who fear losing their job, being deported, or even separated from their children if they speak out. It is critical that we protect immigrant survivors from deportation or detention, which can only cause further harm and trauma.
Hi, I'm Patty Tocosible, President and CEO of Esperanza United, formerly known as Casa de Esperanza and the National Latino Network, and I am another co-chair of the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors. WISE further addresses the lack of timely access to employment authorization for immigrant survivors. Without access to financial independence, survivors are more vulnerable and may endure the pain and trauma of returning to abusive relationships or face homelessness. This bill also allows those with pending immigration cases to be eligible for critical federal public benefits previously denied to them because of the 5-year ban. We must ensure that immigrant survivors have access to food, housing, healthcare, and childcare support that allow them to build a safe and healthy relationship for themselves and their children and recover from violence and trauma.
Support immigrant survivors of violence.
Support the WISE Act today.
Great. So that video from our co-chairs just provides a brief overview of the WISE Act and what we'll be talking about today. But we wanted to start off by giving you more about the history and the context of the WISE Act. So many of the provisions identified in WISE have been identified as priorities from VAWA 2010 and comprehensive immigration reform legislation of 2013. However, as Olivia stated at the beginning of today's presentation, many substantive immigration protections for survivors of gender-based violence have not been included in VAWA for many years. So in an effort to provide more support for immigrant survivors, this past August, HR 5145, the Working for Immigrant Safety and Empowerment Act, was introduced, as it was also introduced during last year's Congress. You might find that some of the provisions that we talk about today in the WISE Act sound familiar, and that is because we've been doing this advocacy for a very long time. So you might see in different bills, such as HEAL and Lift the Bar, that they incorporate some of the provisions included in WISE, as well as the Protecting Immigrant Victims of Domestic Violence Act. All of these are recently introduced bills that contain some similar provisions to WISE, but we're hoping that WISE can really be the most all-encompassing in terms of protecting immigrant survivors in a variety of ways and providing a variety of immigration relief. And you might note that right now, the only bill that has been introduced is in the House, and that is because right now, the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors is currently working on a Senate companion bill of WISE. So stay tuned for more advocacy and information on that as we work on it. Next, I will pass to Casey to talk a little bit more about the types of immigration relief that WISE provides.
Thanks, Gabby. So I am excited to sort of walk us through these different forms of immigration relief through the lens of the types of clients and cases and survivors that the Tahoe Justice Center and others on the Alliance for Immigrant Survivors serve day in and day out. I made sort of a concerted decision not to do one longer survivor story that only fit, one of these potential forms of relief, and instead will sort of walk us through each one with a shorter, more anecdotal length, but to really give people the opportunity to wrap sort of their hearts and their heads around the types of harm and the types of relief that we are talking about. Because we throw around a lot of acronyms. I know that I am guilty of that. And so today, I'm going to unpack some of these acronyms before we go through the rest of this webinar together. So I might dance around this image a little bit, not going to go in perfect order, but going to start with VAWA, because that's something we've already touched on. And I will admit that it is a little bit confusing that we have a giant piece of legislation called the Violence Against Women Act, and then we in the immigration space working with survivors talk a lot about VAWA. What we were talking about there is a VAWA self-petition, which is for survivors of domestic violence who are married to abusive US citizens or legal permanent residents. And so, I think one of the more public cases of someone who was granted relief under VAWA, the ability to stay legally in this country, is a case that Tahirih worked on several years ago of Natalia Fox. She was brought to the United States through a marriage broker, what some people might call a mail order bride company, by an older US citizen man from Kyiv in the Ukraine. When she arrived here, that individual, her spouse, began abusing her both physically and emotionally. And she reached out to the woman who had coordinated her marriage to this man. And that individual at the marriage broker agency said, listen, all US men are crazy. If you want out of this, you can go back to the Ukraine, but never told Natalia that there was an option called the VAWA self-petition, which would have allowed her to report the abuse that she was experiencing. And by virtue of being a survivor of abuse and that abuser being a US citizen, she could apply for a VAWA relief and decouple her adjustment of status, her ability to stay legally in this country, from her marriage to this abuser. And so he would no longer have that ability to sort of waive her immigration status over her as a tool of power and control. She was able to apply for VAWA relief and move forward with adjusting her status, remaining safely in the United States legally without having to stay in that relationship with him and have her immigration status dependent upon an abusive spouse. And so that is, not a typical case pattern. There's no really typical case pattern in any of this. Because we're not always dealing with mail order brides, quote unquote, and we're not always dealing with a US citizen. Sometimes we're dealing with an LPR, but that gives you a sense of what the VAWA relief was designed for. It was designed to give immigrant spouses of US citizens and LPRs the opportunity to get safe and remain legally in the United States without having to depend on an abusive spouse. Next, we can talk about the U visa, which is something we're going to talk about a lot today because it was really honestly designed to fill some gaps in the sort of relief space that VAWA did not cover. And so you can imagine a world in which we have an immigrant woman who is undocumented, who is sexually assaulted at work by another individual who is not documented. That would not be covered by VAWA, right? Because they aren't married. And that person who committed the sexual assault is not a US citizen or an LPR. And so the creation of the U visa was in many ways a response to those gaps. And so that individual in that case, which is unfortunately far too common, would have the ability to come forward, report the assault that happened, participate in an investigation with law enforcement, and by virtue of participating and reporting, be eligible for a U visa, which again allows them to stay safely and legally in the United States. The next form of relief that we're talking about a lot, and it is in the news a lot, is asylum. And some people might have a fairly broad understanding of asylum already, but for anyone who might not be aware of just sort of the basic nuts and bolts of asylum, it is for people who have suffered persecution or fear that they will suffer persecution in their home country based on 5 grounds. So it's race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So you'll notice that gender and sex are not one of the sort of 5 foundational grounds for asylum in the US. And so survivors are often coming forward and claiming asylum under that particular social group category, which gets really weedsy and really complicated. And the opportunity for a survivor, like I'll give you the case of Maria, is a client that Tahereh served. She was from Guatemala. At the age of 15, a much older man in her community decided to take a really unhealthy interest in her. He would show up at every party, at every wedding, at every church service that she went to. And no one, not the police, no one in the community seemed capable of keeping him away from her or helping to keep her safe. And eventually he raped her and she got pregnant and she had a child by this man. And no matter where she went, even after she left her community, even after she tried fleeing to Mexico, he found her wherever she went and eventually tried to kill her by shooting her and her son. It was clear at that point, when she survived and her son tragically died, that the only place that she thought she could find safety would be in the United States. And so she fled for her life based on the severe gender-based violence and persecution and sort of the obvious nature of the fact that this man could not be stopped and this persecution would not end, whether she was in her home community or in a transit country. So she came to the United States to seek asylum, and she would, likely lose her case if she didn't have an attorney from an organization like the Tahereh Justice Center, who was expert enough in making asylum-based claims based on particular social group, because it is so complicated. And so, that is a space that we are working hard to advocate for more clarity in particular social group, but just to say, survivors of gender-based violence can and should have the opportunity to claim asylum in the United States on those grounds. It's just very complicated and often requires an attorney to win. Really quickly, the T visa, when we say T, it is for trafficking survivors, and that's just for survivors of severe forms of trafficking who, again, are participating in a law enforcement investigation. And so an example of the types of cases we sometimes see, especially in the greater DC area, are instances, and you might have seen this case in the news a couple of years ago, in the Washington, DC suburbs. There were diplomats from Kuwait who had brought several women from India who came forward to say that they were being worked like slaves, in their own words. They were experiencing life in slave-like conditions, working many, many hours a day with no pay, and experiencing physical assault from one of the women in the household. And so they came forward, and one of the many charges that were brought in that case was a trafficking charge. And so when we say T visa, that's what we mean. We mean both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and that is a form of immigration legal relief for survivors of human trafficking. And really briefly, SIJS is probably one we don't talk about a lot. It's pretty narrow. It's not as widely used as these other forms of immigration relief, and it really varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction. What judges are you dealing with? What kind of sort of judicial education and other education has that particular community gone through to make sure that people with valid SIJS claims can be successful. But briefly, it stands for Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, and it's for immigrant minors who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent. And to be eligible for that, you're under 21 and you're unmarried and you're already in the United States. And so with that, I think we can move to the next slide. I threw a lot at you. We're going to be sending out the slides and sending out resources so you can sort of continue to wrap your heads around these forms of immigration relief that we are talking about when we throw around terms like T visa, U visa, VAWA. Those are the types of situations our clients are coming to us with. Those are the types of immigration legal relief that they are eligible for. And what WISE Act would do is start to address the fact that these forms of relief should be available, but in many instances, they are not working, or the system is not working to provide the relief as it should in a timely way. So I'm going to start off by walking us through, the video mentioned U visa improvements. I think Archie mentioned maybe 275,000 individuals with pending U visa matters. That number is actually over 300,000 now. And the processing time it takes to place these cases on the wait list is over 5 years. And that's because there is an arbitrary cap on the number of U visas that we can issue every year. And every single year we exceed that cap, and that cap being exceeded year on year on year on has just piled up. And so in addition, we also see a similar sort of backlog and pileup in the special immigrant juvenile cases because they are subject to employment-based visa caps, even though they are humanitarian cases that protect abused and neglected children and youth. And so these significant delays, as well as barriers to obtaining the law enforcement U visa certifications, can subject survivors and their families to additional risks of violence and exploitation and manipulation and trauma because their status remains so tenuous. And you're waiting for status and you're waiting for the ability to work, which we'll talk about in the next slide. You are extremely vulnerable to predators who would take advantage of your vulnerability, potentially offer you safety, offer you housing, offer you unofficial employment opportunities, and then take advantage of you and then re-victimize you. If you can't work and you have tenuous status in the United States, you are incredibly vulnerable. Put that on top of the fact that you are already a survivor of gender-based violence, and you're extremely vulnerable. And so what the WISE Act would do to address these issues and these backlogs with the U visa would be, number one, eliminate the cap. Grant the U visa to as many people who are eligible for the U visa per year as they come. Expand eligibility for the U visa where there are civil findings of culpability for identified crimes by, employment or child welfare agencies. It would add in new purposes for the U visa, including child abuse, elder abuse, hate crime, victimization, and it would decrease barriers to the U visa by allowing victims to establish that they are helpful to investigation or prosecution of criminal activity with evidence besides law enforcement certification, because so many times law enforcement either are uneducated and not familiar or are adversarial towards immigrant survivors, and getting those U visa certifications from law enforcement as is required can be a real barrier to access to immigration relief, justice, and safety for our clients. And so the WISE Act would really address so many of these long-awaited improvements to the U visa that we had hoped to see, in VAWA reauthorization, hope to see, through lots of other potential opportunities in the past. But all of our sort of wish list items for U visa improvements are really captured in the WISE Act. So I think we can go to the next slide and talk about work authorization, which we sometimes call employment authorization, which you might also sometimes hear referred to as an EAD. All of those things are your work permit, your work authorization. And so I think, as I touched on before, the ability to work, the ability to create financial independence is critical to all survivors. We all know the ways in which financial abuse intersects with lots of other forms of harm and abuse to make someone feel very isolated and unable to escape and quite dependent on an abuser. Add unstable or lack of immigration status to that mix, and you have an incredible level of vulnerability again. And so what we have in the employment authorization space is also an incredible backlog and delays in issuing employment authorization and even renewing employment authorization that someone had. So let's imagine you have your employment authorization, you're working, it's about to expire, but your immigration case is taking so long to work its way through the court system that your work permit is going to expire before your immigration case concludes. And you seek to renew it, and the renewal doesn't come in time, and your work permit expires, and you lose your job as a result. These are the types of things that our clients are dealing with day in and day out. And so we see this as really critical to a survivor's ability to escape violence, provide for themselves and their families. And survivors need these real opportunities to leave and overcome violence. And so the sort of fixes to employment authorization that are encapsulated in the WISE Act are requiring DHS to issue employment authorization within 180 days of filing for a U visa versus the status quo of waiting those several years due to backlogs. And so with that, I will hand it off to my esteemed colleague, Kirsten at Assista.
Thanks, Casey. So yeah, if we take a step back for a moment and think back to the legislative intent behind VAWA and the TVPA, We know that the immigration protections were based in this realization that abusers and other people committing crimes had kind of a real ace up their sleeve when it came to harming immigrants. Unfortunately, they, use the threat of deportation to gain power and control over the people that they're hurting, whether that's an intimate partner, an employee, or whoever they choose to harm. Abusers and perpetrators leverage the immigration system against immigrant survivors who fear losing their job, being deported, or even being separated from their children if they speak out. So advocates said, we don't want those who do harm to be able to use the US immigration system as another tool of abuse, and unfortunately, a really effective one at that, right? So Congress heard and understood that, and these bills were passed by bipartisan majorities who agreed. Let's not have the threat of deportation be used as a tool of abuse and a way to silence survivors. So detention and removal of people with victim-based cases really undermines the intent of this legislation. The other piece, of course, is cooperation with law enforcement. So when you protect folks from that threat of removal, it also encourages people to come forward and report to law enforcement instead of hiding in the shadows, fearing that reporting what happened will result in getting deported. So protection from removal is a core principle of this kind of relief, both, to protect immigrants from abuse and also to increase public safety by not punishing folks for reporting the crimes that have happened to them. So if we move on to the next slide, you can see here the specific language in the WISE Act that makes this explicit. So it's the sense of Congress that the Secretary of Homeland Security should refrain from deporting crime victims before their applications for humanitarian relief are fully adjudicated, as it undermines critical bipartisan protections created in VAWA and the TVPA. So again, you heard Casey talk about these egregiously long wait times. That's a long time to be vulnerable, right? And this bill suggests, is it fair to subject someone to removal when their case hasn't even had a chance to be adjudicated yet because our government moves so slowly? And then it also talks about release without conditions. So there shall be a presumption that the alien described in paragraph 2 shall be released from detention without conditions. So basically the WISE Act makes clear what we already know, which is that detaining and removing those with victim-based cases undermines the intent of programs like VAWA. Deporting survivors while they await their decisions on cases discourages them from seeking justice and undercuts the usefulness of these forms of relief as tools for law enforcement to keep communities safe. So the WISE Act will help protect immigrant survivors from deportation or detention. And if we can go to the next slide. Another key component of the WISE Act is that it limits immigration enforcement in what are considered protected areas, similar to what we've thought of before as sensitive locations. So these are areas where survivors often access support, whether that means going to the hospital or other healthcare facilities, a domestic violence shelter, a rape crisis center, other kinds of victim service agencies, going to the courthouse, going to the mosque or the temple or the church or other places of worship, childcare facilities, and more. So again, there's a huge chilling effect to survivors getting faith, getting resources, seeking justice, if folks know that they might be subject to enforcement action when they just go to the hospital or the courthouse or the shelter, right? So there's current guidance already in place that's very similar to this, thankfully. But what the WISE Act does with regard to these protected areas is two things. It strengthens what's already in place. What's in this bill is a little bit of an improvement, makes it a little bit stronger, and it codifies that guidance into legislation, which means it's not easy to change as administrations change, which we know can be really critical for survivor safety. So on the next slide, just one last note from me is that the WISE Act does include exceptions very similar to those that already exist in current guidance. And those limited exceptions have the purpose of protecting national security and threats to public safety, as is typical. And a reminder, excuse me, that the WISE Act protections against detention and removal for those with pending cases and the WISE Act protection against enforcement actions in these protected areas that we talked about, all of these are consistent with and supportive of public safety, keeping survivors safe and supporting engagement with the reporting and investigation of these crimes. So with that, I will pass it back over to my colleague, Gabby.
Thank you, Kirsten. So one of the aspects of the WISE Act that was discussed in the video and that touches on many of the needs that Casey talked about earlier when it comes to employment authorization and ensuring safety and stability for survivors, even after they are able to access immigration relief, is access to public benefits. And the WISE Act contains provisions that ensure survivors have the support necessary so that way they can actually thrive and reduce their reliance on abusers by providing access to certain federal assistance, including TANF or temporary assistance for needy families, supplemental security income, social services block grants, Medicaid, and SNAP benefits. The WISE Act also eliminates the current arbitrary 5-year bar that is in place for many immigrants, including long-term permanent residents, that prevent many immigrant survivors from being able to access public benefits like TANF and Medicaid. So again, just like employment authorization, being able to access these crucial benefits, having access to healthcare, having access to federal assistance, these all go to help immigrant survivors to rebuild their lives and their resilience after experiencing gender-based violence. Another key component of the WISE Act are confidentiality provisions. So as I mentioned before, when talking about the history and context of the WISE Act, many of these provisions have come out of challenges since VAWA 2010 and attempts at comprehensive immigration reform, and these confidentiality provisions are one of them. So during the last administration, there was policy issued that said that any denied survivor applications, such as denied U visa or T visa applications, will be sent along to ICE. So these confidentiality provisions are really key to making sure that when folks are coming forward about abuse that they've suffered, when they are coming forward to work with law enforcement, that they're not being punished for that. It goes to those same provisions that talk about preventing deportation and detention for immigrant survivors. So WISE specifically has provisions that strengthen confidentiality and privacy protections by amending US Code. And it also limits the use or disclosure of information pertaining to pending applications, including under VAWA, T visas, U visas, and SIJ applications. So that information can only be used to actually adjudicate those applications. It can't be used for ICE, it can't be sent to USCIS and other aspects that would seek to harm those immigrant survivors or affect them. Now I'm going to pass along to Olivia, who will talk a little bit more about how you can share more information about the WISE Act and more about why these provisions are so necessary for immigrant survivors.
Thanks so much, Gabby. So folks are going to receive the slides and the a recording of this. So you know, if you couldn't make it or if you want to share with a colleague, you'll have access to those materials. So we're asking you to share those materials and to really get involved in this conversation about immigrant survivors with other folks, right? We know that about 10.6 million US citizens live with an undocumented immigrant. And that was of 2021. So that number is likely much higher. People live in mixed status families and immigrant survivors. So we want to let you know about what kind of action you can take. You can talk to your representative, your member of Congress, about how this issue impacts you, your work, and your community. You can ask your member of Congress to co-sponsor the WISE Act. We would love to see bipartisan support for this bill and see a companion Senate bill. You can also, if you're with an organization, we are still taking endorsements and sign-ons, and we encourage you to share those with your networks. The more support we have, the more encouraging it is. And so we welcome organizational sign-ons. We will share out a social media toolkit, so please share this video widely and some of this information. It would be fantastic to share during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. The Spanish language social media toolkit will be available during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, about the first week in October. We encourage you to share those widely as well. And then please let us know if you have any questions. We really appreciate the questions already coming through in the Q&A section, and we're here to be a support for you as well. So I'd like to pass it along to Casey.
Thank you so much. So yeah, this final slide is just a reminder to folks who we are and where you can find us. And there is a website for the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, which is there on the screen now to give you just a little bit of a better sense of what that group is, who they are, and what they do and what they focus on. And then we have API GBV's website, Asista, Esperanza United, and Tajare's website there for you as well. And I think our next slide is going to focus on the action alert. Is that right? Okay, maybe I was answering a question in the Q&A, so maybe that was already covered by Olivia. So just making sure people get that link to reach out to their representatives and encourage them to sign on as co-sponsors to the WISE Act, and reiterating that call to action. And wrapping up, and with a big thank you to everyone who's on today. 107 people taking time out of their schedules is no small feat, so we really appreciate it.